We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome our next guest onto the show, Madhavi Bhasin. She is the VP of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Okta. Thank you so much for being here. If you could share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
I love that. Thanks for having me, Christina. Hello, everyone. My name is Madhavi Bhasin. I'm the VP of Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging at Okta. My pronouns are she, her, hers. When I was a child, what did I want to be when I grow up? So a little bit of context before I actually answer that question is, I was born and grew up in India and have done all my education. My early childhood has been in India. When I was young, I wanted to grow up to be a police officer.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And the reason for that was because when I was growing up, there was a special TV series going on the life story of the first female police officer in India. She was the first one. And the Hindi name for it was Uran, which actually translates as to be in flight. So that was my oh my God, she's so amazing. And anybody can Google her. Her name is Kiran Bedi. She's still there. But she was the first female cop in India. And looking at that TV series, I was like, I want to grow up to be a cop. Obviously, I did not take that route, but the fact that being the first and the female, I literally trace back a lot of my work with DNI to that early passion of recognizing and being attached to this field even without knowing that this is something I'm passionate about. But very far removed from my childhood dream of being a cop. Here am I, a DNI practitioner. So quite a long journey.
That is quite a long journey, but I think, when we're younger, there's a lot that influences us. And I think asking, where you started is interesting. So if you fast forward to now, how do you think your personal journey has led you to be a DEI practitioner and also specifically leading DNI efforts at Okta?
That's interesting. As I said, my early childhood was a lot around, and even growing up after that was a lot around what is not offered to everyone. So what's not equitable? Why are there some norms, societal norms, professional norms, social norms around these are the things and jobs and behaviors that are reserved for a certain section of the population? So that was obviously very interesting to me. And there was this whole concept of why do we have a first, now that we have a female police officer, how can we have more of them? So a lot of my journey has been in trying to look at social and economic processes and spaces and how they impact individual choices. I started my early career in academics. So I was a research professor back in India. I was doing my PhD in international relations. It was a lot around, again, social processes and movements. And then I moved to the US to continue my research and then and so the other piece that also plays a very big role in my identity is I'm an immigrant. So I moved to the US. So it was very interesting navigating that space and the challenges that come with it. And soon I realized tenure track or writing research papers was not something that would really bring change fast enough as I wanted to. So I transitioned to the nonprofit sector, started working in a lot of nonprofit programs on youth and women empowerment with a lot of companies. I worked with the US State Department on programs around Arab Spring and youth enablement. And gradually in my nonprofit journey, I came more closer and closer to corporate programming on building and creating spaces and processes for historically marginalized, underrepresented groups. And that's when I then moved over to Okta. So though it looks like a few transitions, I would say that I draw a through thread through all these transitions and saying bringing change and creating a more inclusive behaviors, mindsets, and processes is something that is the driving force and passion for me throughout all these different transitions and pivots that I've made. So the journey continues. I'm learning each day and trying to get better myself. I'm a work in progress, and so are the systems and the companies that we are working with.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I definitely see the common thread in your work and really wanting to make systems more equitable for folks, and really asking where can you make the most change. And I definitely want to ask in terms of, the work that you're doing right now, recognizing that the work is never done, but can you give an example of either a system or a process that has changed over the past 2 years, to be more equitable, at Okta?
That is interesting question. Yeah, I would say two things, a little bit of context there. I also think when we look at DNI, we have to look at it in through two lenses. One is a little bit of a program lens of like, what are the programs that I need to put into place to take this work forward? But when you put these programs into place, the other very important enabling factor is that do you have the processes to support it?
Mhm.
And usually a lot of us get carried away with the programs. Like, do you have a mentorship program? Do you have like, a benchmark of we are going to hire X percentage by X year? Do you have this piece, which is important? I don't want to undervalue that, but the success of that also depends on the foundations. So I'll give you a quick example of like, when I joined Okta, there was a lot of questions that came my way of like, when are we going to get to X percentage by X year? Like, when are we setting a goal?
Right.
And the ability to set the goal also depends upon how refined the processes are. So the first thing was when we are tracking our incoming data of candidates, how well are we tracking that? Because it's also a voluntary form. When any of us have applied, we are like, you have to fill in a voluntary form from the EEOC. Do you want to declare whether you identify as male, female, and all the non-binary options and your ethnicity? Now, even before I can get to setting a goal, my focus was how can we drive adoption that more and more people are opting into signing into this. More and more people are opting to choosing to tell us this, or even saying, I do not want to share, which is fine. But a lot of that was left vacant, empty. People did not respond to that. So I'm like, even before I get to that goal, let's fix this process, which is not the cool, shiny object that everybody can talk about. But having to drive adoption for this is related to, are we talking about our company culture? Are people feeling comfortable sharing this with us? Do they feel that when they come here, this is a piece that they will feel resonates with the other people and people managers? So going back to the question that you asked, for me, there are a lot of processes at Okta which we have made inclusive, which I see are the foundations on which now we want to build stronger programs. So this is just one example of driving adoption of how can we get more and more people to respond to our EOC data, and then we can see, do we have a wider top of the funnel? And if not, then what's happening? If we have a wider top of the funnel, then where are we losing candidates in the pipeline? Before we get to setting the metrics and the targets, which is the exciting part, but it's a little bit of the hard work behind the scenes. And I'm just sharing one example, but there are so many more where we have invested in processes and policies that can then lead to the success of the programs and initiatives, which we all want to launch and make sure that they are set up for success.
Absolutely. I think that's important to focus on the holistic perspective because you can't just set the goal without understanding where you are, without understanding the process as it is today to really drive adoption, especially with the example that you provided as well. And you touched on this a little bit in terms of, just your philosophy around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. But can you talk a little bit about how you see the role of practitioners playing into kind of this strategy and really empowering everyone at the end of the day and at the end of kind of the workday and the organization to lead with that equity driven mindset, so it's not only one person or one team's responsibility?
Oh yes, definitely. I love that question and that philosophy. I know we all have talked a lot about, especially D&I practitioners, on of like how this is not just the job of this function. It needs to be, unless and until it's integrated with the rest of the organization, it's very challenging to expect that we'll see any success. My philosophy around this is I see my role and the function that I play and my team plays is we are facilitators.
Mhm.
For us, we are going to facilitate to create more inclusion and more equity, but the actual doers are going to be the business units. So we are like, what do you really want to do? These are the four options. I can tell you how to get from point A to point B. I can lay out the programming for you. but the journey is something that you have to undertake as a business leader and as a business unit. So my philosophy is a lot around like, let's not make DIB as like the 10th or the 11th thing that anybody needs to do. If
Mhm.
there are 10 things that you are doing, you obviously have a lot on your plate as a business leader. How can you add a lens of equity and inclusion in what you're already doing?
Right.
And one example that I usually share is like, okay, if you are in, the FP&A org, you're looking at procurement, you're looking at budgets, and you're like, I don't have hiring targets. My org is very small. How do I build balanced teams? And I'm like, that's not the only way to influence, the conversations around equity and inclusion. You are on the procurement team. Let's think about what are we doing with supply diversity? How much of our dollars are going towards vendors who identify as being historically marginalized? So when I say that, what I'm trying to convey over is like, this should not be the next additional thing on your list. It should be something through which you address everything else that's on your list.
Mhm.
So the idea is I can give you concepts of and provide you with frameworks on how you can incorporate this in your daily work. But then as business leaders, that's the piece that you have to get through with and in partnership, and also realizing that it is going to take time. It's not you'll start working on it and someone like, been doing this for 6 months, there is no success. And I'm like, success in this field is slow to come. If it was that fast, then we would have all our problems would be solved by now. We would not have a dedicated D&I role. So it's a little bit of a marathon, but you have to be intentional about it.
Mhm.
That is the piece that I think is very critical and is missing, because sometimes we say, I understand you didn't have ill intention,
Right.
but you also have to be intentional. Like you can get the benefit of doubt only for that long for not having ill intentions. But sometimes ignorance gets translated as like, you have to bear the responsibility for that. So those are things and conversations that I keep top of mind when I'm talking to business leaders to make sure that I'm empowering them. My job is to be more a coach and a facilitator to enable them to do what they do more inclusively and in a more equitable way.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the enablement piece because you're right. A lot of people are on different parts of the kind of equity journey and doing the internal work, which is really important to having this mindset. And oftentimes, if you are at the beginning of your journey, you think of it as siloed work, as, this is the 12th or 13th thing on my to-do list, but making sure that you're approaching it with that coach facilitator lens and enabling them to make these decisions. I think supplier diversity is really important too, and was a good example of that. Knowing that, people are in different departments and roles, and there's qualitative and quantitative ways to measure this. But how do you think about tracking the progress of ensuring that people are really thinking with this mindset, and measuring kind of the ROI around the DEIB initiatives?
Data. I think there is nothing else that can replace it. A lot of it this has been in the space of I'm doing this with the spirit of doing good. But we have to get out of that mindset, because if I'm building a balanced team and getting underrepresented talent on my team, I cannot see it as I'm doing good,
Mhm.
because we need to move out of that. And that has been the area where we have not been able to track progress, because it's a lot of like the passion and the fields aspect of DIB, which is important. But the other piece, which is very, very important, is to track progress if you're actually moving forward and you're committed, is how are you measuring your programs? And I usually talk a lot about this with my team is we have to move from the mindset of reporting on activities to reporting on impact.
Mhm.
Because a quick example here is we can have a ton of activities that we undertake. We can go to a lot of like sourcing events. We
Right.
can do a lot of like the DNI cultural months and events and things like that. Those are all activities, which are great. But when we are talking about DNI, we also have to talk about what has been the impact of each of these.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's a hard decision, but I also very strongly feel that in addition to the passion that I bring to the job, I also have to bring the mindset of a business leader.
Right.
which is prioritization. There are a lot of things that I want to do that I'm passionate about in the D&I sense, but if I am not going to track the impact of it and report the impact out, or if I'm not able to report the impact out, should we be investing a lot of time, effort, and energy into it? So that prioritization is very, very challenging. And that's where I think it's very important to move from, when you're reporting out on your results, don't talk about just all the activities that you have done, but let's talk about some of the impacts. And then a simple example is we offer an inclusive manager training.
Mhm.
So it's an intact training, which is like some teams and business units can take it. Now, one way of reporting this is we held X number of inclusive manager training, and 80% of the org participated in it. That's one way. That to me is you're still reporting on activity.
Right.
But when we connect it, I'm just throwing out an example. Our product team had 5 trainings, and we saw 80% managers show up. And then we saw that the retention in this team went up by 4%.
Right.
Or this team hired more balanced team members in the next 6 months. That is where the impact. I have given them the training. What have they done with the training? Tie that to the retention numbers, tie that to the hiring numbers, tie that to the promotion of women and URM. And that's where you are now actually starting to measure impact and moving from just activities to the outcomes and what change you're making. So that's how I look at it in terms of the measurement of the D&I programs and the efforts that we put into place. But I should also say it's not like we have all, it might sound that we have all this figured out. Not yet. We are still in the process of how we can refine this and get better at it.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to note that just because, you're tracking success and doing really well, everybody can always, do better and just like reframe things as well. And I think just like sharing best practices is also really helpful in terms of keeping folks accountable. And really, it sounds like what you're talking about is not box checking and saying we've done, 2000 trainings, we've done this. What is the actual impact? And that goes to intentionality as well, and the holistic strategy. I do want to mention in terms of accountability, how do you think about keeping, people leaders accountable to making sure that they are progressing in this diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging mindset, especially, people who are managing people, managers that are managing other managers? What are your thoughts around there?
Yeah, that's the area of like that's our win-win area. I feel if we all are able to figure that piece out, that's a huge win for D&I. But I would also say how I approach it is not, again, I'll go back to the example that I shared earlier. When you are a people leader and you are being more inclusive, you have a higher EQ, you are building teams that are balanced, you have to look at it not from the perspective of you're doing this for the team or for the organization or for someone else. I see this as self-investment and professional development for yourself.
Mhm.
Moving forward, the kind of the workforce that we have, the kind of people managers who will be successful need to have these traits. These are now becoming core competencies of people managers. So if you have an opportunity to learn this and practice this, you're not doing this because HR and D&I is asking you to do it. Because if
Right.
you're looking at it from that perspective, then it's check the box. But you're doing this because these are the core competencies of the people managers of today and tomorrow. So you also have to look at it as you are investing in your own professional and personal development and growth. And once you look at it in that way, then you'll find immense value in it. And also, you ultimately want to run a successful team, an effective team. And these are critical ingredients to make that possible. So, in the long run, if you see it as a win for you rather than a check the box because I've been put on another training and this is part of compliance versus investment in my own growth, then that's where it's going to be challenging. So, I don't think we should always look at this from the perspective of how are we going to hold people managers accountable, but we should educate people managers that once you are investing in your own professional growth and development, this is good for you rather than just like, an external accountability. So that's how I try to approach it and coach a lot of the people managers, like you are in this for yourself and your growth.
I think that definitely makes sense in terms of internal accountability as well. And I think that goes to motivation and external factors. You can give someone the resources, the tools, but they really need to have an investment in this as well in order for this to be successful. And at the end of the day, it makes them better as a professional, as a people manager, as a person, and in the work that they are doing. You mentioned priorities earlier. I'm sure there are so many things that you could be working on and tackling right now. What is the next problem or situation you are trying to solve? Or another way of putting it is what's taking up the most brain space right now?
Well, there is a lot of things. I don't think we have the entire day to record this, but that would be my list. Um, what I would definitely say, a big piece, and I think I've alluded to it a few times, a big piece that I'm working on right now is how can I make sure that D&I is integrated into the business? That is trying to find those spaces and those opportunities when D&I is not just like outside the business. It is something that's considered foundational. And how can we do that? Because a lot of companies are in the era of high growth right now. So we do want to understand that the business leaders have a lot of priorities. For me, is what can I offer that they see as a help rather than one more thing to do. So things what I'm working on for our strategic roadmap next year is like, what are the menu of options that I can give to my leaders? And put these menu of options as these are foundational. This is you should do. And if you want to go above and beyond, these are the four other things you can do. You can like have a sponsorship program. These are the things that you can invest into. So right now, what's taking up a lot of my brain space is in terms of immediate strategic priorities for us is how can I provide some options for our leaders where they feel empowered enough to make the choice of this work, because what is going to work for your technology org may not work for your product org. The challenges might be different. So it's a little odd to say in the terms of diversity, there's one size fits all solution here. So I'm trying to come up with something that's comprehensible, that speaks to all of our business leaders, and also moves the needle forward in terms of what I'm trying to solve from the angle of D&I. So it's a little bit of coming up with the perfect magic matrix of partnership between D&I and the business leaders.
I think that definitely is it sounds super intentional because at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all approach and there's no magic wand, even though people sometimes wish that there was, because what we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, as we're talking about people, everybody is different, every employee is at a different stage of their life. But when people do feel like they belong at an organization, they're happier, they produce better work, and it's just a win-win for everybody. My next question is around kind of that employee happiness and company culture in terms of how do you think about, the qualitative and quantitative ways to kind of measure a healthy company culture or, areas of improvement?
There are a few ways of doing this. I know one standardized way is like, every company runs employee engagement surveys. The cadence might be very different. And that's definitely a very standardized way of looking at how the employees are feeling and driving results. I know a lot of companies also run pulse surveys of like every month and smaller organizational surveys. But I think a few things that we can definitely add on, given right now that we are and continuing moving forward are going to be in a dynamic workspace. Like for a lot of companies, that's become the reality. And that's where also the challenge is. How do you measure a lot of how engaged and happy the employees are feeling? A few things that I think are very, very critical to do is given the remote workplace that we are in, it's very important for leaders to continuously talk about the values and the culture of the company. You cannot over communicate what are your values, because those are the values that your people leaders have to live, and that is going to impact a lot of your employee engagement and your employee I would say even to the point of like retention, which is is a great challenge that a lot of companies are dealing with right now. But there are features like, connecting. I always going back to the D&I lens. I always say employee resource groups. I always define employee resource groups as the ERGs or the nervous system of a company. They can actually tell you how healthy or unhealthy a company is. I love the idea of having engagement surveys, but when we look at the results of the engagement surveys, it's very important to break it down by gender and minority groups and see how they are feeling. And that's where I think you have to continuously work together with your employee resource groups and the leadership and the members to try and understand how they are feeling. What is the mark that we are missing there? Because we all know a lot of our systems and processes are not designed for the underrepresented minorities. So even though you might be trying very hard, it's very important to take a step back and see, are we factoring all the groups when we are looking at employee engagement? And are we factoring all the unheard voices, or the voices that don't have a seat at the table when you're looking at employee engagement? So focus groups, making sure that you are communicating enough with your people managers of how to keep employees engaged is very critical. And I'll wrap up this section by saying that it's very, very important that all teams have their own ways of connecting with each other. It's only so much that you can do at the organizational level, which is very important. But the bonding that the teams have with their peers and their leaders is something that needs to be cultivated at the team level. So being very committed, I cannot remember, there was a podcast that I was listening to last week where someone made a very interesting comment of how many of us as people leaders put unstructured time on our calendar, which is like, this is like just unstructured time. Everybody comes together, no agenda, not even like, oh, let's have a happy hour. Let's talk about, it's just like, what's top of mind for you right now? Let's come up with that. So those are things that we have to do as people leaders and people managers, to be like, just create more room and space, because that's where the actual connections happen, or that's where you miss a lot of the connections. So you have to take this at different levels and have continuous touch points to make sure that it's not like, oh, check the box, I did it once. This quarter I met with my team and it's all fine. Now I'm going to meet them next quarter when things come up. So you have to be very intentional and you have to work at it continuously.
I think that that sounds really kind of intentional too, in terms of the strategy and making sure that I was talking to someone the other day as well, that they were running kind of a pulse survey or an engagement survey, and they had a 90% kind of participation rate, but that 10% really did focus on a lot of people who identified as part of a historically marginalized group or in the minority. So it's really important to have additional channels to make sure they feel like their voices are heard and it's psychologically safe for them to do so as well. I know we talked about really important to make sure that people leaders and business leaders see equity as part of the lens of how they're making decisions and processes, not necessarily at Okta, of course, but just in the world. Are there any common mistakes you've seen companies make in their diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy, even with the best intentions?
I would not call it a mistake. I always say that all companies are at a different maturity level in terms of their D&I journey. So something that you might have seemed right for your company a few years ago, and now that you have matured, it doesn't seem to be the right approach. So that's how I look at it. But I think one thing I would definitely say, if you're looking at your D&I programs and initiatives purely from the lens of compliance, that is where it will definitely fall flat, because then you're looking at it as something that you just have to do and check the box. And given our the workforce that we have right now, they really want their employers to go above and beyond in creating a more inclusive space. And you can only do that when you go beyond compliance. So that I would not say is, and some companies, to start with, you might have to have a focus on compliance to get a more buy-in from business leaders. But that is the piece that I think companies need to navigate in terms of their maturity curve a little sooner. And the second I would say is make sure, and again, this is where you are on the curve, but make sure that you are consciously making efforts to integrate D&I into your people processes. Because if you're trying to keep it as a silo, then that's where the challenge is going to come. Whether you're looking at your total rewards, whether you're looking at your employee experience, talent calibrations, recruiting, Um, the DNI pieces, and you will be at different points in your journey, but at least start the journey of trying to see what you can do to integrate it into all these people processes in some format. It might not get completely integrated over the next year or so, but what are the low-hanging fruits that you can start looking at and focusing so that you are at least starting on that journey? That I think is very, very critical, because DIB working in a silo is not going to get much success in the long term.
Absolutely. And like you said, change doesn't happen overnight. We need to be thinking about things from the long term and with a strategic lens, and also with the business lens too, because this is something that is good for the business and also individually for the employee themselves. You mentioned kind of the changing workforce, and a lot of folks are talking about refreshing their kind of talent management strategy for the new year in 2022, because the people are, their greatest strength. What's your recommendation for folks to kind of refresh their talent management process to be ready to kind of hire more folks and really maintain a great company culture?
That's an interesting question. I wish we all had the right answer to that, and then we could solve the great resignation. I think we should first start with understanding none of us have the right solutions. This is a very evolving situation, and we need to be agile in solving this. So I feel like, it's not that we have the right mix of solutions yet, but I think the secret to success right now is let's try what we think is going to work, but let's also be agile with our solutions. Let's try and see. Let's do a lot of pilots and experimentations. I know a lot of companies are putting into place what they are calling like stay interviews, like, just engage with a lot of your talent who you might think might be out of the door, and how can you engage them and how can you hear from them. And I was on a call earlier this morning with a few heads of DNI, and we were talking about how you can put a stay interview in place, but how you design that is critical. Because
Right.
when you're putting a stay interview in place, the person in charge in that conversation needs to be your employee and not the people manager. But usually when we put this into place, it's the other way around. It's the people manager who comes with a bunch of questions of like, okay, let me tell. But the idea is it's a stay interview. The focus needs to be on your direct report or your team member. So a lot of solutions, I keep hearing a lot of them. I just want all of us to remember that when we are putting these into place, let's think a little long term, and let's make sure that we are not doing this just to check the box. Like, oh, everybody else is doing stay interviews, we should also do stay interviews, but how are you structuring these? What are you building into it? And work flexibility is a big piece right now. Employees do not want to give that up. And how are you going to have a talent management strategy that factors that flexibility into place while keeping your employees engaged?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is that piece of like everybody can work dynamically, but then employees are like, I feel lonely, I'm not as engaged. So this is like a little bit of a balancing act that we all are learning to play right now. uh, I wish I had the exact answer of what this would look like. I would say right now our best bet is to try a few solutions, be very intentional, and measure what's working and what's not working, and try and tweak it as much as we can, because this is an evolving situation. I don't think any one of us have the exact answers, but if you're not doing anything about it, then you are definitely kind of out of the game. So you need to have a very actively evolving talent management strategy right now, and keep your ears close to the ground. It's very difficult in a virtual environment, but really hearing what your employees want, rather than like, I'm the expert talent management person, let me put a strategy in place.
You don't want to assume what people want as well. And I think that was a really good example too, in terms of stay interviews. If a lot of people are doing that, especially in your industry or, company size, you have to think about capacity. You have to think about building that out and not just doing it to check the box, because also employees can tell if you're just doing something to do something and say that we have this
Oh
thing,
yes.
have this perk or benefit. It needs to have some intention and resourcing behind it as well. Is there anything that I either didn't ask that you want to share at the end of our conversation today, or maybe 1 to 2 key insights you hope listeners bring with them after hearing this interview?
One thing that I would like folks to leave with is uh, no matter what your role is at a company, I would really encourage you to actively think of how you can, what you do, make it more inclusive. So
Mhm.
don't just be like, I sometimes there are people across different teams who reach out to me and say, I want to be on the DNI team. I'm so passionate about this. And I'm like, you should not be on the DNI team. The fact that you're passionate about it and you're embedded in the technology org or the product or the finance org, stay there, because the impact that you can make there is going to perhaps be more of what I can make from the outside. Because
Absolutely.
remember, the DNI teams have only that much influence. You have a lot of power that you have, and positional power and influence when you are within an org. So no matter which team you belong to, at least think of 1 or 2 ways where you can, what you do, make it more inclusive and do it in a more equitable way, rather than assuming that this is the job of your DNI leaders or your DNI function.
That is a great call to action to end on. I know that a lot of folks are actually talking about that as well, as the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging continues to grow, which is really great. But you don't need to be directly in the team or in the field to make a difference. You yourself can make a difference if you are in the sales, marketing, FP&A, like you were talking about. There are so many ways you can kind of lean into this work as well. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. Thanks.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we believe in that employee feedback management and know it's a requirement to get that feedback for the company to succeed. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.